Resuming debate, the honourable member for Cypress Hills Grasslands.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm glad to be here today. I wish that the message we were hearing from the government was different than what it is. And when I hear them talk about things about needing to broaden the scope and to focus on all rights rather than one specifically, they talk about focusing on pluralism and international organizations, civil societies. All of that is fine, but it has very little to do with the specific issue of religious freedom. I heard one of my colleagues on the other side actually talk about how she wanted freedom for everything. Well, the reality is that the religious freedom issue works very well as an issue when it's picked out specifically and when it's dealt with specifically. And as my colleague just pointed out a few minutes ago, that most of the conflict that we're seeing around the world right now is actually of a religious nature, and so we need to consider that when we're talking generally about conflict in this world. The Office of Religious Freedom was established in 2013. It was established as a division of Foreign Affairs, and it was a fulfillment of a promise that we made in the campaign in 2011. Mr. Speaker, it had a very small budget of $5 million, and I actually think from looking around that $5 million was probably used as well as any $5 million in this government from what I could see about it. The mandate was pretty straightforward, and this is from a presentation from the ambassador at committee, Foreign Affairs Committee, where he talked about it had a mandate to defend religious communities and monitor religious freedom. It has a mandate to promote religious freedom as a key objective of Canada's foreign policy, and it has an a mandate to advance policies and programs that support religious freedom and promote pluralism. And it's unfortunate to see the government opposite basically turning their back on those things, blending them into a whole bunch of other things, and I think we'll see that the effectiveness of what they're doing is going to be hampered by the fact that they do not want to deal with this as a specific issue. It was not established as a generic rights organization, and it was not established that way for a reason, because it would have been completely ineffective, would not have had the focus that it had, and it would have been of little use to anyone, I believe. Mr. Speaker, was set up as nonpartisan, and it was set up to be able to work cooperatively with faith communities, with NGOs, and with other countries, and that is what has happened with it. Obviously, the choice of ambassador was a good one. Ambassador Bennett has become internationally respected for what he has done. He was wise enough, Mr. Speaker, to appoint an advisory committee, covered faith groups, non-faith groups, found a great variety of people there, and did a good job at putting that together. And as one of my colleagues pointed out earlier today, that included those folks who think that or believe that they have the right not to believe in any specific faith at all, and the ambassador was wise enough to include them in his advisory committee as well. And once the office got rolling, of course, there were a number of projects that were brought forward, and I guess I was excited when I looked through the list of things that the office has contributed to over the last few years, but some very practical things. This hasn't been an organization that's been operating in the sky. It's been one that's operating right at ground level, trying to make a difference. And so there were lots of smaller projects. I think this government opposite is going to regret the day when they have shut down this office and shut down the projects, because they've had the opportunity to do things like working with media, doing media training in other countries to inform media about what hate speech is and how they might deal with it in their countries. We've done work on monitoring religious freedom in various countries. Obviously, the United States Commission on Religious Freedom does its annual monitor about religious freedom around the world, but we've been able to help local communities monitor religious freedom and how it's being achieved in their communities. There's been a documentation of violations as well, and just so that people are held accountable for what they're doing. The office has provided leadership courses, so leadership courses for people in their communities to come together. Obviously, one of the places was in Nigeria, where we were bringing together interreligious communities so that they could sit down and talk to each other to try to create peace in areas where organizations such as Boko Haram were trying to disrupt communities, destroy social fabric. And one of the things that we were doing was in there trying to promote the dialogue and the peace between the communities there. Sharing best practices was another important aspect of the work of the commission of the office. And then certainly things like kids' educational materials. Doesn't seem like much, but there was money put into making sure that textbooks and those kinds of things were not promoting religious hatred, and working with countries to try to make sure that their educational materials were solid as well. So awareness activities, research and academic studies, facilitating seminars and leadership legal support and supporting legislation. Those are all very practical things that the office provided. And I don't hear anything today coming from the other side about how they're going to continue to be able to provide those kinds of things on that micro level, right down at the community level, saying to people and saying to smaller countries, we're going to work together with you. The question needs to be asked, is this relevant? Is this an issue that's relevant right now? And I'll give you a present example, Mr. Speaker. This government's going to be absent on an issue I think that's very important, and that is in Nepal right now. They're putting together a new constitution, and there's some legislation coming forward around religious belief. We should be there. We should be there helping them, assisting them. It appears as if there's now being manipulation so that both these documents are going to be pre-designed, and they're going to end up suppressing minority believers. Mr. Speaker, that's something that doesn't need to happen in this time. They're talking about prohibiting things such as conversion. One of the main aspects of Article 18 of the United Nations Human Rights Declaration is that people should be free to choose their belief. They talk about prohibiting proselytization. They're talking about doing things like impacting the opportunity of people to speak freely about what it is that they believe in, and then moving to protect some religious communities while they're restricting others. Mr. Speaker, the people of Nepal don't all have the opportunity to fully understand or discuss what these values and these objectives mean, these issues mean, but we certainly can be providing them with some help and assistance. And it's just one example of where we can help. This is a country that signed on to the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and that includes in their article the notions that people have the right to be free to believe, people have the right to be free to practice their belief, and people have the right to be able to change their beliefs. So these are things that happen at a very practical level, and our government should be there. And I would say that this government, in its rush to, as they say, broaden the scope and focus on everything, is not going to be there on these specific issues where people are going to, and some of these countries are going to need help. There's one other thing that the ambassador has headed up that I think is very critical and important, and it's going to be lost, I think, when this government shuts down the office, and that is an international contact group on freedom of religion. It was put together. It was basically spearheaded by Ambassador Bennett, and he was the one who chaired the inaugural meeting, and it's called the International Contact Group for Freedom of Religious or Belief. And it's brought together government representatives from over 20 countries in a multilateral, a diverse effort to try to put networks together, to work together and to collaborate together to address the challenges that are caused by international religious persecution. This is the kind of thing my colleague who spoke just before, noted that most of the tensions and the pressures that we're seeing come out of religious belief. This international contact group is an excellent way at the administrative and government level for people to be able to get together and to talk about these issues. The ambassador was central to the launch of that group. It included all kinds of members, including places like Cameroon, Chile, Morocco, Canada, the European nations. So it was an important initiative, and I fear that it's going to be lost in where this government is going. Even the United States Commission for International Religious Freedom and others have praised this initiative. They saw it as important. They wanted their countries to participate in it, and it was a critical tool that was in place in order to underline the freedom of religion or belief. So, Mr. Speaker, we're going to lose a lot if this government has made a decision that it's going to basically shut down the office. It has a choice. It can renew the mandate, as I said earlier today, with enthusiasm, so that it can continue to maintain the momentum that it's already created, or I fear that they're going to dilute it, basically probably by defunding it, gutting it behind the scenes, or making it into some sort of generic rights organization so that this right will be lost in the midst of a lot of other things. And I think the reason that this has been successful is it has been very specific. It's been a very narrow focus, and that has allowed the ambassador and the office to be able to create the kind of initiatives that they have. And, Mr. Speaker, it does not seem that the government understands this. It's unfortunate they don't seem to do that, but persecution because of religious belief is very targeted. It's very specific. It needs to be dealt with in those ways. This notion of, for one example, the right to convert, whether people have the right to change their beliefs or not, that can't be dealt with some generic human rights approach. That has to be dealt very specifically with. You must give your people the freedom to be able to believe what they choose, and then the right to be able to change that. The Pew Foundation has said that 3/4 of the people on this earth live with the fear of religious pressure, and that the violations are perpetrated by states, non-state actors, and sometimes both in conjunction with each other. So there's a lot of people in this world who need the protection that was provided by countries paying attention to this issue. It is unfortunate that Canada has taken such a large step back on defending religious freedom, and certainly we want to continue to protect them. We will do what we can on this side of the House to make sure that happens.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Mount Royal.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I want to congratulate the honourable member on his speech, and I certainly share with him the conviction that we need to stand forefront for religious liberties across the world. And as a result of that, I'd like to ask the honourable member, I heard him say that the biggest struggles in the world today were solely religious liberties. I'd like him to look at in Cuba just yesterday, where women were arrested for exercising their freedom of speech to protest against the Castro government. Countries in Africa and in the Middle East where gays and lesbians are subject to capital punishment for something that we consider a fundamental freedom here. And to recognize that there are many rights throughout the world that are deserving of our protection. Now, Mr. Speaker, I think that there's so many things in this House that we generally agree on, and we fight back and forth about nuances. Had this motion, Mr. Speaker, been worded to say that we ask that the government recognize everything that's in A, the good work that is being done, and B, that the existing work of the office be continued in the same or a different, broader format, I think, Mr. Speaker, there would have been unanimous agreement in this House, and we could have all gone forward talking about how we all agree with religious freedom. So I'd like to ask the honourable member, why was it necessary to write the motion to say that we continue the existing absolute same mandate without saying that we simply agree that we want to continue the valuable work the office has been done in the same or a different mandate, where you would have had support from the government?
Honourable member for Cypress Hills Grasslands.
Well, Mr. Speaker, first of all, we don't continue the same work with a different mandate, clearly. And I actually take objection to what he kind of the way he tried to characterize what I had said. I did not say that all pressure and persecution around the world is solely of a religious nature. What I said was 75% of the global population lives in countries where they are restricted in terms of their freedom of religion or belief. And I think the examples he's mentioned are just examples of places where people are not free to believe as they choose. And so the government feels that it has a right to interfere with that freedom of belief, has the right to come in, and whether it's people who actually believe it and have a religious faith or it's people who have chosen not to, the reality is that if we don't have the freedom to be able to believe and to choose those beliefs, we don't have any other freedoms as well.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Calgary Nose Hill.
Mr. Speaker. You know, Mr. Speaker, I think that many of us in this place have grown up in a very secular society. Canada's pluralism is one that affords the opportunity of religious freedom, but under the umbrella of a set of rules that we live by that support our pluralism. You know, freedom of religion, freedom of equality. There's so many things I could talk about, but now that I've had the opportunity to travel the world a little bit in my role as a parliamentarian, what strikes me is that the reality is a large portion of conflict that we see in the world is in fact religious, has its roots in religious practices. So to divorce religious freedoms from foreign policy, especially given that rooting, is, I think, somewhat short-sighted. My colleague talked about freedom of religion and of women, and I guess what I'd like my colleague to answer is this. Given this particular fact, can he talk about how the Office of Religious Freedoms and its focus on dealing with intergenerational change in terms of religious freedom actually helps reduce these conflicts, given the fact that we can't ignore the fact that religion is a basis for many of them?
The honourable member for Cypress Hills Grasslands.
Well, that's actually a very good question, Mr. Speaker, but I would make the response to my colleague that we look around the world and we see that some of the best freedoms come out of religious expression and out of religious belief. Some of the worst repression comes out of religious belief and religious faith as well. I think the place that we find ourselves is that we believe those three articles of Article 18 are critical, and that is that people should have the freedom to believe. So they have the freedom to believe as they choose. They have the right to practice that belief as long as it's not violating someone else's space and their rights. And the third thing is that they have the right to change that belief. If people can exist with that, I think that we will see that that those types of repressive attitudes that we're talking about today are not they're just not capable of being carried forward in the society. Basically, if we've got religious repression, it typically breeds instability in a country. It breeds further extremism. We can look around the world and see that. It generates refugee flows. We're seeing that. That's a massive issue right now around the world. It threatens other fundamental rights, including things like freedom of expression, freedom of association, freedom of assembly. So I think out of that freedom of belief come a lot of the other freedoms that we have as well, but we need to understand that religion can be used as much as anything else in order to repress people as well.
Resuming debate.